welcome to another episode of the Heartland Author Podcast. I'm Aaron Apollo Camp. For today's episode, I had the honor of interviewing Dave Cole, the author of the Math Kids series of books and the author of The Window. Due to a technical issue where during the interview an audio echoing issue would occur anytime I was talking, but would not occur when Dave was talking, portions of the interview when I was talking were re-recorded after the interview took place. I'm here with Dave Cole, author of the Math Kids series and The Window. Dave, welcome to the Heartland Author Podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. Looking forward to the chat.
Feel free to introduce yourself to our listeners.
I kind of took a little bit interesting path to being an author. Had actually gotten a job with a large social media company based out of California. I'm from St. Louis. Was going to move my family out there for a couple of years. Looked at housing prices, looked at the area, all kinds of things, and said, that's probably not going to work. So I commuted back and forth for about 18 months. So it left me with a lot of kind of free time on my hands. I had run a bunch of elementary school math camps while I lived in St. Louis, and they were very popular. Kids kept coming back, and I said, you know what, I'm gonna write a book on how do you run a math camp. And a lot of what I did was tell stories that had kind of a math background. And so I started to write the book, and I said, I should write down some of these stories. I took one of the stories and became book length by the time I was done. And I said, that's more fun than writing about how to do a math camp. So I ended up writing the first 3 books in the series before even talking to a publisher. A guy at work said, you ought to try to get them published. I said, I'll give it a shot. So I reached out to some agents, wasn't getting a lot of response there, reached out to the very first publisher I talked to, said, send me over book 1. And then they said, send me over book 2. And send me over book 3. And had a contract for the first 3 books. And since then I've signed contracts for books 4 through 6, and then 6 through 9, and we're talking about the next 3 in the series after that. So it's been an interesting journey. It's been a lot of fun, and in the middle of that, I had this idea for more of a young adult novel, a little bit paranormal, and called The Window, and wrote that and published that actually through a different publisher.
Without spoiling too much of each of the books in your series, what are the books in your series, The Math Kids, about?
So each book, they're a little bit educational, but I try really hard to make it just fun for kids. So if they want to learn some math, they could absolutely learn some math reading through these books. And there's an appendix in the back of each book that talks about the math side of things a little bit, and there's teacher guides and so on. But I want it to be a fun story. So if somebody comes in and goes, I don't like math at all, that's fine. You can read it. They're kind of mystery stories where kids use their kind of math skills to solve mysteries. The first book, for example, is called The Primetime Burglars, and there are some burglars in the neighborhood, and they figure out through some math where they think the burglars are going to hit next, and are able to work with the police to capture the burglars. So each book has kind of a math concept. So the Primetime Burglars, the big math concept was about prime numbers. The latest book that just came out this week, The Triangle Secret, was about Pascal's triangle, which is an interesting kind of math concept. And it ends up playing into how they're able to solve the mystery.
Do you believe that stories in which math plays a central role, such as the stories in the Math Kids series, can help in making math class more interesting for school students?
Absolutely. I've had some teachers that have contacted me and said, we have your books in here, and part of what I do in the books, there are some times in there where I actually present some puzzles and kind of math puzzles and give kids an opportunity. It'll even say, hey, stop, if you want to solve this on your own before the math kids do, here's the puzzle. And she said, so we do read alouds of the story, and when we get to a puzzle, everybody breaks into groups, and they love it. They love solving these puzzles. And I've had a lot of kids that have reached out to me. I love hearing from readers, like I think all authors probably do. And they said, I really didn't like math, but now I see it, I get it, and that there's more to math than just worksheets and things like that. So that's part of the goal, was to make math fun. I look at things like like any kind of sport, right? We see professional athletes, and we can go out and then kick the soccer ball around the backyard or hit a baseball or play catch or whatever. But math is, you can't do that same thing. You can't look at professional mathematicians because we would never understand their equations. So what I wanted kids to do is say, oh, there's all kinds of cool things about math. There's patterns. There's math is involved in art and music and all kinds of different things that I don't think we get to kids early enough in their age to get them excited about math, so they may want to look at some math farther down the line.
In my case, the reverse would have been true if the Math Kids was available when I was in school. Math was one of my favorite subjects in school, and English was typically my worst subject.
Yeah, I've gotten that flip side as well, right? And I was probably on that side. I loved to read a lot when I was growing up, so I guess my English was probably okay. But I loved the math. I loved solving puzzles and working on math problems and things like that. So I probably would have been like you. I would have gotten into it for the math, and then the story would have hopefully taken me along. But yeah, so we're trying to hit both sides. If you have kids that love to read, not so big on math, this is a great way to get them introduced to some math. We've got some other kids that hate math or love math. They may go in and go, oh great, there's puzzles and things like that inside there, and oh, I guess the story's okay too. So either approach I think works.
Without spoiling too much of your book, what is your book, The Window, about?
So it's about a guy that goes up in the attic. He's bringing down some Christmas decorations for his mom, and he sees a window up in the attic that he's never seen before. And it's this beautiful octagonal window, and he looks out, and he sees something that hasn't happened yet. So it really becomes kind of a portal into the future, but just what he can see out of that window. And shortly into the book, as he's looking out this window, he sees his best friend, has been his best friend for forever, gets hit by a car. He's riding on his bike, gets hit by a car and killed. So it's now, can I change the future? I've seen what's going to happen. Is there any way I can prevent that from happening, or am I just kind of destined to know that's going to happen at some point? And that's kind of the premise behind the story. And I really got the idea. I was working in my office and I heard a screech of brakes, and I went looked outside the window and I saw a car and a bike. And the bike was not hit, but they were talking to each other. So you saw it must have been a close call. So that kind of just stuck in my head actually for a couple of years. And I thought, what if I'd been able to warn that kid, watch out, a car is going to come close to hitting you? Would that have prevented it? And that's the kind of idea that stuck in my head all those years. And finally wrote the story down, and I really enjoyed it. I started that book with the ending because I know how I wanted it to end, and I knew how I wanted it to begin. Unfortunately, and you're an author, you know how this works. Sometimes the beginning didn't get me to the end as I wrote. I don't outline a lot when I read. I kind of let the story take me more. I write more as a reader, I think, and I see where the story goes. I couldn't get to the ending, and even though I loved the ending, I had to throw all that hard work away and change the ending to a place where I ended up getting naturally through the story.
Are all of your books self-published? Are all of your books traditionally published? Or are some of them self-published and others traditionally published?
It's a great question. As I talk to other authors, that question comes up a lot. I'm in a couple of social media groups with authors, and there's always that debate: should I self-publish? Should I go through a traditional publisher? Mine are all through traditional publishers. For me, that's been an advantage. And I'll give you an example with the math kids of now been translated, I think, into 6 languages. So we just signed a international agreement with South Korea, so they're going to be um, translating all of the books. They're even redoing the illustrations. They've also been translated into Turkish, Mongolian, simplified Chinese. That's all things that I would not have been able to do self-publishing. I just wouldn't have had the capabilities or really even the opportunities to do that. So that's worked out well for me. And I understand self-publishing as well, and I thought about that with the window going a different approach, but I found a publisher that was really great to work with, so I went ahead and went that route.
What is your typical writing routine if you have one?
It's a little bit hit and miss. I wish I was a little bit more formal about the routine, but there are some times that I'll sit down and I will write for an hour and come up with one sentence that I will then delete. It just wasn't flowing. And there were other times this weekend, yesterday, for example, I probably wrote for 6 or 7 hours, and it was just flowing. And I booked a lot of words yesterday, and it was just kind of working. I usually write for a while. I will go back about a week after I've written something and go through and edit. So I try to edit as I go through the book, and then of course I'll go through a full edit at the end, and then I also work with the publisher as an editor for me, and then work with them on that. But I try to write at least a little bit each day, a little bit more on the weekends. But I wish I was probably more disciplined where it was every single day I knew exactly how much I was going to write and so on.
Do you plan on writing more books? You mentioned this a little bit earlier in the interview.
Yeah, we will probably write more books in the Math Kids. We've been putting out 2 a year, usually April and October, and that works. I can fit that in pretty easily, and it still gives me time to work on some other books. I'm working on a couple of other novels at the same time that I'm kind of hopping in between. But there certainly is plenty more math to go around, and the nice thing about a series is I started with 3 kids and added another kid to the little group, to the Math Kids group, and they've grown. There's story arcs. You could pick up any of the books and read it individually. You could pick up book 6 and just start there if you wanted, but there's some backstories now, and there's progression. We see how their relationships change, and as they get a little bit older, I'm aging the kids as I go along. So that's been kind of fun to see those changes as they happen.
When doing research about your background, your Amazon Author Central page's biography notes that you've done work on designing missile guidance systems. Without revealing any top secret or otherwise classified information, what is it like to work on designing missile guidance systems?
It was actually pretty fun. I was a young engineer just out of school, and went out to the middle of the desert out in a little bit near Carson City, Nevada, and we were working on they were anti-tank missiles. So we actually got to fire some of these missiles. They had dummy warheads, but it was kind of fun to fun to see those results, and I had simulation programs that say, hey, I think the missile's going to do this and this, and when it actually did it, I was always excited about that. But it was it was an interesting experience. Spent about a year out in the desert doing that, and it's something I think back on and say that was kind of a fun year.
Dave, it was wonderful to interview you, and thank you for appearing on the Heartland Author Podcast.
Thank you very much. It's enjoyable, and I always tell readers, reach out to me. I've got a website, themathkids.com, and happy to talk to people. You can learn more about the books and what I've been working on. Read some sample chapters, all that other good stuff in there as well. So thanks very much for having me.
You're welcome. I thank Dave for agreeing to appear on this podcast, and he was a wonderful guest. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to write your imagination. Bye for now. You can learn more about me and my book writing projects at authoraac.wordpress.com. You can also follow me on Facebook and Twitter at authoraac. You can also watch videos on the Heartland Author channel on YouTube. Copyright 2022, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of its audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this podcast episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.